Japan's organized crime syndicates, commonly referred to as Yakuza, have worldwide name recognition. Images and portrayals in foreign media of cold-blooded katana-wielding mafia-esque delinquents are surprisingly not entirely based on reality. In fact, most Yakuza groups are sophisticated organizations with a rich portfolio of activities, both legal and illegal, and violent actions are usually restricted to the underworld. One group, however, is famous in Japan for its aggressive conduct, brutal inter-syndicate wars, and even the committal of terroristic acts with no regard whatsoever for the life of civilians, the so-called Kudo-kai. Yakuza groups have their origin in the Bakuto groups, who facilitated illegal gambling starting in the Edo period. The continued urbanization led to criminal enterprises surfacing to serve the needs of an urban population, like gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, or security. Since the end of World War II, the Yakuza and the police maintained an uneasy relationship based on a gentleman's agreement. The police basically grudgingly acknowledge that people will always have special needs outside of the law, so instead of fighting an endless war, they allow the Yakuza, an organized group based at least on internal laws, to administrate this underworld and make sure that ordinary civilians or katagi do not get into the crossfire. In return for no prosecution, the Yakuza do not deal drugs or engage in fight with police officers. This uneasy peace, however, continued to be disturbed by incidents where Yakuza overstepped their bounds, or police sacrificing a prominent Yakuza as a scapegoat for an unsolved case. Since the 1990s, official policy is to slowly strangle Yakuza activities by increasingly harsh police presence and law enforcement. Today, the romanticized image of the Yakuza from the 1980s is gone, and politics, police, and media encompass a united front against organized crime. Accordingly, the Yakuza are referred to as Boryokudan, or violent groups, in the news. There are hundreds of affiliated families and groups in Japan, with many having reduced their activities sharply and all but pulled out of the public eye since the Organized Crime Prevention Act from 1991 was passed, the Kudo-kai being the exception. Based in the north of Kyushu, notorious for its Yakuza activities, the Kudo-kai is a relatively small organization with an estimated membership of around 400 people according to police reports. Despite their size, they are the only Yakuza group in the country the police refer to as Tokutei Kiken Shitei Boryokudan, or especially dangerous designated violent group. The Kudo-kai is part of an alliance of smaller syndicates based on Kyushu that opposes the Yamaguchi-gumi, the biggest Yakuza syndicate in Japan with more than 8,000 members. Since the 1980s, Yakuza groups in the region can be divided into pro-Yamaguchi and anti-Yamaguchi factions, and the conflict has turned to an all-out war in the 2000s when the Kudo-kai assassinated a boss of the Yamaguchi-affiliated family. In 2003, the Kudo-kai committed arguably its most public act of violence when it detonated improvised explosive devices as well as hand grenades in a high-class club in Kita-Kyushu. A dozen civilians were seriously injured, and survivors described the horror of the attack on national television. This attack on ordinary civilians separates the Kudo-kai from other Yakuza groups, hence the special designation. The group even caused a diplomatic incident in 1988 when it attacked the Chinese Consulate General's office in Fukuoka over an alleged dispute with the Chinese mafia. On paper, getting civilians involved in Yakuza violence goes against both written and unwritten rules in almost all families. In practice, other Yakuza groups try their best to not get any civilians involved when they commit violent acts against other criminals or affiliated people. But the Kudo-kai often either doesn't care about collateral damage among ordinary civilians, or even uses civilians in order to underscore the severity of their actions. Their brazen disregard for consequences when involving civilians is what separates the Kudo-kai from other Yakuza groups, and has led to it becoming the nemesis of Japanese law enforcement. All of this has put an enormous pressure on the police and the judiciary to restore order in Kita-Kyushu and protect the lives of civilians. In 2011, after 3 decades of violence, Satoru Nomura became the 5th president, or Sosai, of the Kudo-kai. Nomura's ascension to the top is often regarded as a turning point in the conflict between the Kudo-kai and law enforcement, as Nomura is considered to be even more violent than his predecessors. Just 1 year later, in 2012, a retired police officer of the Prefectural Police for Organized Crime was shot at in broad daylight and severely wounded. The officer was responsible for investigating the Kudo-kai up until a few years before his resignation. In 2013, a nurse of a local plastic surgery clinic where Nomura was treated was stabbed in the head by a Kudo-kai member. These cases led to a police resolution that was unique in the country as of this point. They declared an operation to completely decimate and disband the Kudo-kai. In 2014, hundreds of police officers stormed the private residence of Nomura with a search and arrest warrant. He was charged with having ordered the murder of a fishermen union's president and 3 counts of attempted murder, as well as tax evasion. The heinous nature of the alleged crimes led the judge to pass down an unprecedented judgment. In 2021, Nomura was sentenced to death, despite the lack of clear evidence. The judge argued, however, that because of the strong organizational structure of the Kudo-kai, responsibility always lies at the top, and the underlings simply blindly comply with any order given by the boss. This is the first time a Yakuza boss has been sentenced to death in Japan. Hence, the ruling is considered a landmark case, as it has set a precedent for top-level accountability to be applied even at the highest level of possible punishments. The death penalty can be passed down to any convicted murderers in Japan, but usually serial killers or cold-blooded murderers of an especially evil nature are put to death, while conventional murderers are sentenced to life imprisonment. After the ruling was passed down, Nomura threatened the presiding judge, saying that he will regret this. Since the ruling, Nomura is behind bars, although he has appealed. The sentencing seemed to have an adverse effect on the finances and membership numbers of the Kudo-kai, as many offices have been sold or demolished, and many members have quit and returned to being civilians. Despite that, Nomura continues to lead the syndicate from behind bars, which is evident as even executives from allied Yakuza groups came to the jail to visit him. The disbandment of the Kudo-kai, which is the main goal of the authorities, however, is still far from reality.